So without further ado, let's begin. First up, we have our keynote speaker, Professor Razeen Sally. Professor Sally is the Associate Professor at the Kuan School of Public Policy at the National University, and he is the Chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies, the main economic policy think tank in his native Sri Lanka. Previously, he taught at LSE, which is London School of Economics, where he received his PhD. He has been the director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, which is a global economy think tank, and he is the chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council for Competitiveness. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and on the advisory boards of the Institute of Economic Affairs, UK, and Centre for Independent Studies, Australia. He's also a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. So let's welcome Professor Razeen Sally. Already. Just give me a moment. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'll leave that alone. Can you hear me at the back? You can. Okay. Sorry, I can't see you very well at the back because I'm wearing my reading glasses. I lost my other glasses somewhere in the UK. But I can see those of you in the front more or less. Right, well, first thank you, Brian, Henry, and team for the invitation to be with you and speak today. I'll just put this down. What I'll do do I have half an hour? Okay. So in the next half hour, what I'll do is talk about the prospects for capitalism in Asia, the state of capitalism in Asia and what its prospects are. And time allowing, I might just have a few comments about Singapore and the need for this new Adam Smith Center in Singapore. And I'm very happy to be associated with it. It's been a long time coming that Singapore has a think tank devoted to free markets and economic freedom, and I'm very glad it's finally happening. Now, what I'm going to do today is give an abbreviated version of a talk I've been doing the last few months in a few places. And on this slide, there are links to a couple of essays which relate to what I'm going to talk about in Australia's Quadrant magazine. And the last link is to a longer talk I gave for Advocata in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago. Now, capitalism in Asia. Let me start with three preliminary observations on the subject. And I have to start with something idiotically basic, and that's what is Asia. Now, the ancient Greeks, to them, everything west of them was Asia. Of course, ancient Greece was the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, as it were, the Middle Kingdoms. And everything to the west was Asia. This is a World Bank map, an economic map of Asia, divided according to levels of per capita or real income. I'll come back to this later, but as you see, Asia is even more vast and diverse than Europe, all the way from the Middle East, West Asia, the Central Asian steppe. Russia is on this map, Mongolia, South Asia, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, Greater China, Japan, the two Koreas, all the way down to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Now, I can't talk about all of that, least of all in half an hour. So when I talk about Asia, I am mostly going to talk about this subset of Asia. That's to say, South Asia, revolving around India, the Southeast Asian countries in that archipelago, as you see on the map, Greater China, Japan, South Korea, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. So this is an arc from South to Southeast and Northeast Asia, and then down to Australasia. And that really is the political and economic and global heart of Asia. It contains Asia's three main countries, Japan, China, and India. So the bulk of its population. The bulk of Asia's economy is right here. And the heart of Asia's politics and international relations is here as well. Now, my second idiot question is, what is capitalism? The title is Capitalism in Asia. Now, of course, I'm talking about the state of the market economy in Asia, but that's not enough. I want to get to something deeper than the basic definition of the market economy, which from Adam Smith onwards we've understood as a price mechanism that allocates resources, that brings production and consumption together according to a certain set of property rights. Now, when I talk about capitalism, I'm talking about different interpretations of how the market economy works and how it's embedded in politics and society. And that brings me to what Robert Heilbronner once called the worldly philosophers. Many people's first introduction, first exposure to economics and political economy is in Heilbronner's book, The Worldly Philosophers. And here we have four of them initially, and each of them with different perspectives on capitalism. Now, to Adam Smith, it's very much about what he called natural liberty, the liberty of the individual, which propels a market economy to go ever wider within a country and across countries. Specialization, the division of labor. Below him is the German Friedrich List, who wrote against Adam Smith, and whose main ethos was for the government, for the state to intervene in the economy, to catch up with the leading powers. Then we have Karl Marx, who of course had a fundamental critique of free market capitalism in particular. And then we have Max Weber, with his sociological, socio-cultural views of how capitalism works. And then finally, we have this gentleman here, who I'm going to talk much more about. Not about his personality, that would be a whole lecture in and of itself. Most economists are very boring individuals, then and now, perhaps even more so now. One could talk about their private lives on the back of a postage stamp. But not true with Schumpeter. I used to do a lecture on Schumpeter at the LSE, and I sometimes got carried away talking about his very colorful private life. I won't do that here. But Schumpeter was the first major economist, by the way, who actually used the term capitalism. And by capitalism, he meant the most advanced stage of capitalism revolving around innovation. The term he used was creative destruction. And I'm going to come back to that in due course. My final preliminary observation is about, or what I'm going to talk about, are the three faces of capitalism in Asia: the economic, the political, and the global. And when I thought about these three faces of capitalism, particularly in Asia, I thought of this image here. Now, this is the Hindu Trimurti, the three conjoined faces of the three supreme divinities of Hinduism: Brahma, Vishnu, and Krishna. Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the preserver; and Shiva, the destroyer. So the three faces of capitalism, the Trimurti of Asian capitalism. Let me now go into the substance and start with the economic face of Asian capitalism and how it's changing and what its challenges are. And what I've done is essentially made a division of Asian economies into three categories: rich Asia, Middle Asia, and poor Asia. So let's go back to this map of East, Southeast, and Northeast Asia, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And what you see from from this slide, not sure if the pointer works, doesn't matter. Rich Asia are the countries colored in red. So these are countries with a per capita income of $12,000 or above, according to the World Bank definition. That's the equivalent of the West in Asia. And it's basically Australia and New Zealand, which are the Western outposts in Asia, not just economically, but politically and culturally, plus the first generation of East Asian tigers: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the city-states of Hong Kong and Singapore. Then we come to what I would call Middle Asia, which is upper middle income Asia. So these are countries with per capita incomes of $4,000 to $12,000. These are the countries that are associated with the so-called middle income trap in Asia, because they've graduated from being poor, but they're not yet rich. And there are just three countries in this category in the part of Asia that I'm looking at. It's China, plus two much smaller ones, Malaysia and Thailand. Then we come to a vast swathe of what I would consider poor Asia, from the very poor to the somewhat poor. It's testament to Asia's success over the last 50, 60 years of development that the countries that are very poor, that are categorized as low income, are now just 3 or 4. It's Nepal, it's Bhutan on the cusp, it's North Korea, predictably, it's East Timor, and that's about it. Afghanistan as well, if you count Afghanistan as part of South Asia. But beyond that are a number of other countries that are poor, but are much less poor than they used to be. And that includes India and other South Asian countries, including my own Sri Lanka, and the poorer countries of Southeast Asia: Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. So there you have a whole range of countries in Asia, from rich to middle to poor. Now, let me talk about the challenges that they face. And to talk about that, what I'm going to do is, again, make another categorization, and that's of stages of economic growth. There are two basic stages. I'm simplifying here. But the first stage of growth is what is popularly known as catch-up growth. And that's when governments and economic actors marshal the basic resources of land, labor, and capital to generate as much growth as possible when countries are poor. And so they catch up by marshalling those inputs. It's what Paul Krugman calls perspiration type growth. But there comes a time when you can't continue to grow like this because you're no longer poor. You're subject to what economists call diminishing returns. Your societies start to age, returns to capital become less and less, land becomes more scarce. And so you have to then move to a different type of growth, which is more about improving the efficiency of your economy, improving your overall levels of productivity, of labor and capital and land. It's what Krugman calls inspiration as opposed to perspiration. So if you think of those two categories, those two stages of growth, and you relate it to this map I showed you earlier, what it tells us is this: In poor Asia, there is still huge room for catch-up growth because these countries are still poor, from the very poor to the poor. So their challenge is to generate as much catch-up growth as possible through those inputs of land, labor, and capital to essentially get to that middle income stage where China and Malaysia and Thailand are already at. So that's the challenge all the way from Nepal to India to Indonesia. I'm simplifying somewhat, but that's, I think, the basic challenge. However, for Middle Asia, and that's China, Thailand, and Malaysia, they're now coming close to the end of that catch-up growth. Diminishing returns have already set in. Societies are aging. Returns to capital are diminishing. And growth rates have slowed down tremendously, as we see in China. So these societies, if they're to fulfill the expectations of their people, particularly a bulging middle class, have to move to a different type of growth, which is based much more on efficiency or productivity, using their factors of production more efficiently, as opposed to simply throwing as much of those factors at growth as possible. And if you're in rich Asia, and that of course includes Singapore, then your challenge is certainly not catch-up growth, because that's well behind you. It's to improve the efficiency of your economy as much as possible. In other words, to improve productivity. In Singapore, that's been a problem for some time. Productivity growth for such a wealthy economy is remarkably low. So there we have the basic economic challenges of poor, rich, and middle Asia. Now, none of this is going to happen automatically. It's not pre-programmed. So that raises the question of challenges to policies and institutions across Asia. And again, let me go back to that map and start with poor Asia. What the record tells us is that where we've seen growth, success with catch-up growth in Asia, it's happened largely because, as the World Bank put it in their best-selling report, The East Asian Miracle, which came out in 1993, because these countries, and the World Bank was referring to the first generation of East Asian tigers, got the basics right. They had reasonable political stability. They had macroeconomic stability. In other words, their public finances were in order. Inflation rates were not too high. Their domestic economies were less distorted, had more competition than other developing countries. They had more flexible labor markets. They paid more attention to education and infrastructure. And not least, they were much more open than other developing economies to international trade. So they were getting the basics right, which provided the foundations for their very successful catch-up growth. And all the policies I mentioned are pretty much out of the Adam Smith playbook. So this is, if you like, a kind of Smithian program for catch-up growth. Now, there is a Listian program as well, because many of these economies, many of these countries had governments that intervened significantly in the economy through industrial policy. And there's an argument as to how successful or unsuccessful this was. I won't go into that here because there isn't enough time. But I think the basic ingredients of catch-up growth success in the past has been getting those basics right. So I think the challenge for countries in poor Asia remains to get those basics right. And those basics were set out in the Wealth of Nations. They have to be updated for the early 21st century. However, it does get more complicated if you're in Middle Asia or Rich Asia. They have to get the basics right as well. If you're in China, if you're in Malaysia, Thailand, and also in the rich countries of Asia. But they have to go beyond that with, if you like, second-generation reforms that get more deeply into the institutions of the country, the economic and political institutions of the country. Now, what the record shows is that you can do catch-up growth successfully, 8 to 10% rates of growth per annum, even with a lot of corruption, without the kind of rule of law that one would understand in the West, with dictatorial regimes, with a lot of crony capitalism or crony socialism, whichever way you'd like to label it, providing you get some basics right. That's the record. However, when you want to move to that second stage of growth, which is much more about improving productivity and focusing much more on the efficiency of your factors of production, your labor market, your land market, and your financial market, you then have to pay much closer attention to improving your institutions, the institutions of your financial market, of your land market, property rights, of your labor market, of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary education, of research and development, of accountancy standards, bankruptcy procedures, and so on. That gets us into a much more complicated thicket for economies that need to generate much more innovation, and that's where I would mention Joseph Schumpeter again. We're talking about the transition to a Schumpeterian type of capitalism that so far these countries have not had. So those are some of the challenges out there for policies and institutions for poor, middle, and rich Asia. So let me now ask a quick question. How innovative is Asia? Now, this is much in the news because wherever you look, on television, in your social media feeds, and in newspapers like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, you will see, hear, and read a lot about innovation, particularly in China, and about the prospects of China actually catching up with and overtaking the West on innovation. Now, to what extent is this happening? Now, to cut a long story short, one can point to plenty of anecdotal examples, real innovation happening in Asia, including innovation in China. Bike sharing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and the list goes on and on. But there are three areas in which all Asian countries, including rich and middle income Asian countries, seriously lag in innovation and lag compared with the West. Firstly, public sectors in all Asian countries, including the rich ones, are generally much less productive, even compared with public sectors in the West, state-owned enterprises in particular. Secondly, across poor and middle and rich Asia, you have much bigger pockets of private sector crony capitalism that are protected from competition and generate higher rents or profits for themselves than equivalents in the West. And thirdly, small and medium-sized enterprises generally tend to be much weaker than they are in the West. There's a much bigger productivity gap. Productivity measures are still very much a work in progress, but generally what we see is that even in rich Asian countries like Singapore, there's a much bigger productivity gap between the best firms and SMEs than there is in the West. So there are big problems with productivity and innovation in Asia. Here's a quote from Paul Krugman, that productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. Again, to cut a long story short, what this chart shows us is a productivity problem in Asia. So for all the talk and some of the reality of real innovation happening in Asia, not least in its biggest market, China, we still see that productivity across Asia lags the West and particularly the United States. Now, you would expect that of the poorer Asian countries and of the middle-income Asian countries, but the real puzzle is why rich Asian countries, including Hong Kong and Singapore, with per capita incomes that are higher than they are in the United States, still seem to lag the United States considerably when it comes to overall levels of productivity. Okay. Now, let me just make one big conclusion on the economic face of Asian capitalism, and it's this. The last 50 to 70 years have seen extraordinary success with catch-up growth, a certain type of capitalism across Asia, for the reasons that I described, broadly to do with getting the basics right. But with hindsight, that's the easy bit. And one should beware of linear extrapolation, of believing that just because it's happened in the past, it will continue in the future. As one British politician said, beware of linear extrapolation, it makes you go blind. Now, the problems of the future are going to be that much more complex. Yes, there is still a lot of room for catch-up growth in much of Asia, in poor Asia. But once you get into Middle Asia and rich Asia, growth in the future is going to be more difficult to generate, because it's got to be more of this innovation type of growth that depends on productivity improvements, which in turn depends not just on getting the basics right, but on improving the quality of a country's institutions. And that becomes much more sensitive, and not least sensitive, because it gets us into very messy and sensitive politics, including the heart of countries' political systems, which wasn't really the case with the previous type of growth. So, that leads me to the second phase of capitalism in Asia, and that's its political and institutional phase. And to get a sense of how capable Asian countries are to move to this kind of Schumpeterian capitalism I talked about, we need to have a better understanding of the state of capitalist institutions in Asia. In other words, of the mix of state and market in different Asian countries. What is the role of the state? How does the state relate to public, other public, as well as private actors in industry, in finance, with labor unions, with NGOs, and so on? And of course, the answer differs from country to country in Asia, because Asia is so incredibly diverse. Now, if you explore the literature of comparative political science in Europe, you'll come across a literature called Varieties of Capitalism. And what it does is it topologizes capitalism in different parts of the West. So Anglo-Saxon economies, starting with the United States, are supposed to have a sort of liberal market economy type of capitalism, more or less. Different to, say, Germany and some of the corporatist or neo-corporatist countries of Europe, which have a more coordinated type of capitalism, where you have more cooperation between the state and some peak actors. And then in some countries, for example, in Southern Europe, you tend to have more direct mercantilist types of intervention by government. So just as the West is diverse in its varieties of capitalism, Asia is actually much more diverse. But I just point out to one common feature that one sees across Asia, even in some rich Asian countries, compared with capitalist institutions in the West. Two common features. Firstly, there's much more hierarchy. So wherever you go in Asia, even in rich Asia, including Singapore and Japan, the only real exceptions are Australia and New Zealand, within politics and within business, decision-making tends to be much more hierarchical. Power is more concentrated in a few or fewer individuals. Secondly, relations among actors. For example, between governments and business in particular, tend to be much more clientelistic. They have fewer checks and balances. It's much more about a few individuals who do deals bilaterally, largely shielded from public scrutiny and assorted checks and balances. So that's quite common to capitalist institutions across Asia. What I want to do here is to ask really three hard political questions about the future of Asian capitalism. The first is this. Schumpeterian type capitalism needs more competition and less protection for state-owned enterprises, crony capitalist, private businesses, and so on. But it also needs cooperation between actors. That presupposes a certain institutional maturity or stability for education, for research and development, for infrastructure. That's problematic because often business in Asian countries, from poor to middle, even to rich Asia, is dominated by state-owned enterprises and private actors who sit on their rents and whose interest it is not to have more competition. That's a big roadblock. Second, what I have here is the political economy of factor market reforms. What I mean by that is this. So far, we've seen a lot of liberalization of product markets across Asia, not least, especially, the markets for consumer products. What we have seen much less of is liberalization of the factor markets of land, labor, and capital. That's not accidental because these get much more to the heart of political systems. Let's take China as the main example. Now, the party, Communist Party, recognizes, at least officially, that China needs factor market reforms to generate a different type of growth. It needs a liberalized financial market. It needs more secure property rights, particularly on the land, in the countryside. It needs freer movement of labor, given the restrictions that exist at the moment with the hukou system. Now, in 5 or 6 years of President Xi Jinping's time in office, we have seen very little of that. It is not in the least surprising, because serious liberalization of land, labor, and capital in China would eat away at the monopolistic power of the Communist Party, in a way that liberalizing the market for Apple products in China does not threaten the power of the Communist Party. So there's a conundrum here. China needs to move to a different type of growth because its old state type of growth has been exhausted or is close to being exhausted. But it can't seem to do so because it can't liberalize these crucial factor markets, because doing so would upset the apple cart of China's political system. Now, you find echoes of that elsewhere in Asia. You have to ask a big question in Malaysia, which has a new government, and there's a liberal spring in the air in Malaysia. Malaysia needs to reform its Bumiputra policy in particular, which provides affirmative action for the Malay ethnic majority, if Malaysia is to move to a more innovative type of capitalism. Can Malaysia really do that politically? If not, then the chances are Malaysia will be seriously stuck in a so-called middle-income trap. So there we have problems with factor market reforms. May I have 5 more minutes? Finally, political systems. I haven't addressed this directly so far, so I'm going to do so now. To move to a more innovative Schumpeterian type capitalism in at least the more advanced parts of Asia, how does it relate to political systems on the continuum from authoritarianism to liberal democracy? Now, with catch-up growth, this question doesn't matter that much, because you can do catch-up growth, that's what the evidence tells us, under a variety of political systems. And as we've seen, both India and China have had successful catch-up growth with very different political systems. But now the more interesting question is this: for this more innovative type of capitalism, Schumpeterian capitalism, can you do it under an authoritarian political system? Now, the increasing consensus close to a conventional wisdom in this part of the world with its admirers in the West is that, yes, you can. The West has its problems, increasingly, with its messy liberal democracy. Whereas China, with a state-directed economy, can actually direct superior innovation using its mix of the state and the market in a much better way than the West. And so an authoritarian China, so the argument goes, can actually catch up with the West on innovation and even overtake it. A combination of Mao and markets, if you like. That seems to be the increasingly popular view. Now, of course, a classical liberal would take issue with that. And by contrast, if you look at the work of James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu in their book Why Nations Fail, they make the argument very clearly, and for a classical liberal it's a persuasive argument, that to have this more advanced type of capitalism, one that is really about innovation, you can't do it with institutions that are closed and extractive in their terms, which is what authoritarianism is basically about. What you need are institutions that are inclusive and open. You need checks and balances. You need a form of liberal democracy. And I have great sympathy with that argument. But it's an open question. And of course, China is the great test to see which way it will go. Very finally, let me now say something about the third or global face of Asian capitalism. Asia's success so far with catch-up growth, starting with East Asia and then spreading to South Asia, over the last 70 years, has taken place in a particular macro order for the region and for the wider world. And we're talking here about the order of global security, as well as the order of the global economy. And both, of course, have involved the leading role for the United States. So what have we seen in the last 70 years? We've seen the United States not just as the leading security power worldwide, but the balancing power in Asia. So a combination of American military alliances, boots on the ground in some countries, and a naval presence, not least the 7th Fleet, which docks most of the time, or much of the time here in Singapore, has provided regional security. And American leadership, unilaterally, bilaterally, and in setting up international institutions, has also provided the public goods for a flourishing global economy. So that's been the past, a combination of stability and openness, very much with American leadership at its heart. But we see that changing faster than most of us anticipated in this part of the world in the last few years. So what we see is an America diminished and in retreat. Of course, it seems to be particularly pronounced under this president, but it's been happening for a while, at least since 2001 and the Iraq War. And at the same time, we see a surging China in this region in particular. And an increasingly assertive China has the following manifestations. A more overt physical presence, not least militarily, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Cross-border infrastructure initiatives, also through setting up parallel institutions, such as the AIIB and other infrastructure banks. And then thirdly, perhaps the most important part of this, a sort of recreation of the old tributary system, where China has relationships with smaller countries that are dependent on it, particularly for infrastructure and through debt. And I can speak from experience from my own Sri Lanka. So that leaves me with three scenarios for, if you like, the geo-economic future of Asia, which is important for the future of Asian capitalism. One is a sort of continuation of the Pax Americana. In other words, the United States will get over its present moment and get back to leading the world in a modified form. The second is a power shift to Chinese leadership, maybe not in the world, but in this part of the world. And third is a vacuum. As America declines and as China rises with much more tension and conflict. So let me now conclude. Those three faces of Asian capitalism. There is a challenge to move to more innovation and a Schumpeterian type of capitalism in at least some parts of Asia. Secondly, there's a challenge with Asia's political and economic institutions to actually support that transition or transformation. And thirdly, there are big shifts going on in the macro order in the region and in the wider world, which raise some serious questions about the future of capitalism in Asia. My own view is that there is too much optimism in the West, as well as in Asia, about Asia's future material progress. Again, beware of linear extrapolation. And I think there's too much optimism on China's future in particular. The lazy optimism is that China will actually move to become a much more innovative economy under its present authoritarian system, which is getting more authoritarian, and that China will provide benign constructive leadership under its present authoritarian system, the present party state, in the wider Asia. I have serious doubts about all of that. So my very final comments are these. And getting back to our classical liberal bearings, I think success in Asia in the past has a lot to do with the ideas that go back to Adam Smith and David Hume and forward to Hayek and Friedman and others. These are not just Western values, these are Asian and universal values. They just happen to have started, to have been propagated, to have taken material effect more in the West historically than elsewhere. But the extension of economic freedoms in Asia out of that Smithian playbook has, I think, been responsible for much of the catch-up growth that we've seen. I would like to see Asia move to a more Schumpeterian type of capitalism, but to do that, I think, requires institutions that are not less, but more liberal. More democratic as well. I won't get into definitions of democracy here, but I think we need to see a broader move towards more, not less, liberal democracy in Asia in order to generate this type of capitalism in the context of open, more open, not less open societies. Now, I don't think that's going to happen under Chinese leadership in this part of the world or beyond. I think it's unlikely to happen without some sort of continuation of American leadership. So that raises, of course, a big question about a battle of ideas and interests in the United States. The decline and end of American leadership in the world is neither desirable nor pre-programmed, just as China's rise, I would submit, is neither necessarily desirable nor pre-programmed. So there's a battle to fight, not just in the United States, but also in Asia, and that includes here in Singapore. I've spoken for a bit too long, so let me stop there. Thank you.